Okay, so let's start. Is that okay, Saurabh?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us on this session on hiring trends during the current pandemic times with Saurabh Jain. As most of us know, Saurabh was also on the panel on exec search during the last 5 hour in Delhi. He's the founder of Connextio, and he founded that executive search firm in 2017 after a long career in Deutsche Bank spanning across continents. Connextio is a regional exec search firm with offices in India as well as Singapore. Before founding Connextio, Saurabh was Chief Operating Officer for APAC, Corporate Finance and Banking team at Deutsche. And as a member of the leadership team, a key component of his role was to analyze resource requirements and to identify, recruit, and manage talent across all levels. Saurabh is a chartered accountant and also an alumnus of IIM Ahmedabad. He graduated from Chicago Booth in 2005. Thanks for joining us, Saurabh. Before we start the session, I would just like to highlight a couple of housekeeping items. Nitin is maintaining the tech backend of the session, including mute controls. And if you have any questions for Saurabh, please submit them via chat to Nitin, and we'll try to include them in the Q&A at the end if time permits. Saurabh has a hard stop in 1 hour, so let's try to compress as many questions as possible within that time frame. Also, please note that Saurabh will not be answering any questions on any specific organization. So let's try to avoid those. With that, I will request Saurabh to please share his views on how he is seeing hiring evolve during the current time, especially during the last few months since COVID has hit us.
Sure. Mandy, thank you very much. And also to Anil for being the prime mover behind this. And of course to yourself, Mandy, and Nitin for helping implement this. And as always, CK and Lenora were handling the backend for us. To take your first question, Mandy, how has hiring changed? Very briefly, what's happened is that hiring is still happening, but it's slowed down a lot. It's become much more selective. People are really hiring what they need. They're not really doing a lot of nice to have hiring anymore. And price points are being negotiated a lot harder than they were pre-COVID. So it's basically become a slower, more attritional process, and price points, salary negotiations, etc., have become a lot tougher than they ever used to be in the pre-COVID world. That, I think, is a high-level summary of what we are seeing.
Are you seeing any specific sectors attracting more activity than others?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes. What we're seeing is that within the startup ecosystem, although the big boys, we've all read the publicly available news articles about companies like some of the rideshare companies, some of the e-commerce companies having to do a lot of layoffs. There remain a fairly big group of companies that have raised a lot of funding in the last 6 months to a year, and are continuing to look to deploy that capital. Capital is typically deployed in technology, marketing, and people. And all those three components are continuing to remain fairly robust for the well-funded startup companies. Within that, the sectors where we are seeing healthy activity are certain parts of fintech, health tech, and to some extent edtech as well is showing some good signs of coming back. In the old economy, many of the players are obviously hurting. However, again, and this will be counterintuitive to many, there are actually certain NBFCs that were established again fairly recently in the last 6 months or so, which have raised good amounts of capital and are now using this opportunity to pick up quality talent from other organizations while preparing themselves for come back in the business. Real estate is another sector where in certain slivers, such as the commercial real estate, the office and warehouse space, where the impact has not been to the same extent as it has been in retail or residential, there also we continue to see a reasonable amount of activity. It's again less than it was, but it continues to exist. I think these are three of the sectors that we've seen a fair amount of activity in the last, say, 2.5 months.
That's interesting. So, from a candidate's perspective, should should the focus be more on targeting bigger companies, established companies, or established startups?
I think the more established startups are the ones that are hurting the most because they tend to be in the last mile B2C space and are exposed to the consumption economy. Things like the ones I mentioned, like ride sharing or e-commerce. So those are probably going to be a bit of a struggle in the short term. I don't know if you should really base a job search based on what is happening immediately now, because I think there is a reasonable possibility that there is some kind of broader recovery in the job market vis-a-vis today in the space of the next 3 to 6 months. So I think to respond by saying that at this point, these are the sectors that are hiring and these are the ones I'll go after, if that doesn't align with your longer term career goals, I don't think you should be doing that, because if you're not the kind of person who's got the mindset for a startup, joining a startup could prove to be a very costly mistake. And if on the other hand you have the entrepreneurial, working 25 hours a day kind of mindset, then moving to an established corporate could potentially set you back professionally. So I think you need to stick to your knitting and focus on what you really want to do and where you think you'll succeed, even though the market is tough right now.
I think that's a very interesting point. And, on that note only, I've spoken to a few people and myself included, sometimes when you're looking for a job and you've been on the bench for a few months, then you start thinking that should I diversify my, the options that I'm looking at in terms of roles. So for example, let's say I'm an asset management person, I'm based in private equity, but should I also look at venture, or should I also look at corporate development, or should I also look at some of the ancillary functions, let's say wealth management or something? Is that a good idea?
Yes, I know. Look, so to be clear, I'm not suggesting that people put themselves in a box at all. What I'm suggesting is people don't respond tactically and in panic and tear up everything that they've worked towards till now, because the market is undergoing a little bit of a fairly considerable disruption now. Look, the closest parallel to this, although it perhaps wasn't quite as bad, is the 2008 financial crisis. In August, whenever it was that Lehman went down, people were in panic. There was talk of how the entire financial system is going to collapse and how things will never be the same again. And guess what? In 6 months, things did come roaring back. This time it might take longer, but so far I don't think there's a reason to believe that the entire underpinnings of the modern economic world have changed. And most of the industries that currently exist will continue to exist with some amendments. So I absolutely agree that a little bit of flexibility and looking at adjacent industries, ancillary roles to what people have done is definitely the thing to do. I mean, for example, you brought up the example of private equity and VC. If somebody's been an investments person in private equity for the first few years of their career, there might be more opportunities currently in the operating side in the private equity world, because portfolio companies are going through unprecedented amounts of stress, and the private equity firms, investing firms, they need all their energy currently to be focused on making sure that those companies stay afloat and that they conserve capital, etc. And they need help on that. So there might be opportunities there. Now, on the face of it, it might not traditionally be the most glamorous part of the entire buy side, but that could be where there are some really good opportunities to make a mark. And I would definitely suggest people show that kind of flexibility at this time.
That's interesting. That's very helpful. Thank you. Also, I think one of the standard questions always is that how should a candidate engage effectively with an exec search firm? Usually, my personal experience has been that unless and until an exec search firm has reached out to me, if it has been the other way around that I reach out to exec search firms, the response is not that positive in terms of following up and and looking for roles, etc. So what's the right thing to do?
Look, See, I think if you take a step back and just look at the entire dynamic between a potential candidate and a search firm, it's always going to be a mix of the transactional and the strategic. Transactional to the extent that you want a job out of it and the guy wants a fee out of it, but strategic in the sense that from your perspective, what you want is that when he has a role for you, he presents you as the best candidate or as one of the two best candidates out of the 5 CVs that he's presenting. And what he also wants is that when you're on the lookout, he is one of the guys you think of, right? Because he obviously wants your business. Now, how do you make it work for all sides? I think one of the things to do from your what this side of the table obviously should do more of is putting itself in the shoes of the candidates. What the candidates I think can also do is put themselves in the shoes of the headhunter to the extent of if you're reaching out to a headhunter whom you don't know at all, and the guy doesn't have anything for you, it's difficult for him to do anything beyond be polite and promise to get in touch with you when he has something. So my advice is that it's important, obviously, to find headhunters who have the access that you need. But I also think that candidates don't always cultivate relationships with headhunters. There tends to be a transactional approach, definitely on the side of the search persons, but also to some extent on the side of the candidates, in that if the guy doesn't have something for you today, you've left your details with him and you're kind of hoping he'll get in touch when he has. Nothing wrong with that at a high level, but the fact is that if you're able to build a bit of a relationship with him, maybe you ask him out for coffee instead of him asking you out for coffee, then when he's thinking of something, when there is something, not exactly a perfect fit, but something worth talking about, you're one of the people he thinks of. One of the things you can do is when you do reach out to headhunters, maybe reach out to them through references rather than cold call. Because especially in this market, I can tell you from our own example that we are being inundated with CVs and calls and requests for connections from potential candidates, because it is a difficult market, and I understand that. But if you, Mandy, were to send me a message saying, hey, this is a friend of mine, she's looking out, she wants a change, do you mind having a chat with her? Then obviously I would prioritize her over somebody I'd met over cold call. It's a bit like, you move to a new city and you want to find a doctor. Will you just go to the first doctor you see, or maybe you go to the doctor that your neighbor recommends? That doctor may not be any better, but you might be able to build a better rapport with him because of the reference, and start with that maybe. Try and find a relationship angle as opposed to purely transactional. But I do take your point that there's a lot of work that the executive search community also needs to do in terms of taking on a more relationship approach.
Yeah, and I think what you've said is part of it. What you also mentioned during the panel during Pi Bar, that it's about relationship building too, and that's a golden rule for networking, at least to me. That instead of making it transactional and reaching out, once in a blue moon whenever you need a job, it's always a better idea in general, not just for recruiting, to focus on building a relationship, to actually knowing the person, so that your recall value also increases. That's exactly what you're saying.
Also another thing that sometimes candidates don't always appreciate, and no reason why they should, but something that is perhaps a little bit unknown to them, is that recruiters also have their own networks just because of being part of a particular industry. Now, my company may not do a certain kind of recruitment, or not work with certain companies, or have a hands-off with certain companies. And if I hear of a certain role that's suitable for you, if you're somebody who's become more than just somebody that I speak to once a year, but somebody that I have coffee with twice a year and exchange Diwali greetings with, I might remember to connect you with something else that I hear of in the market, right? But that's only going to happen if you've got that relationship going, and not if you're just someone on a WhatsApp list.
Very fair. You also touched upon a point which I've usually wondered about and never actually asked anyone. When an executive search firm like yourself, when you are looking for a candidate, approximately what is the funneling of resumes that you actually show it to the company or the hiring manager? Like, are there 10 resumes that you show? How many interviews do you do? Like, how does the proportion work? Like, how much is the competition is essentially what I'm wondering about.
Fair enough. Look, there's obviously no magic number. It depends a lot depending on the role, depending on how well I understand or my company, the consultant understands the company. If it's a new client, you tend to send them more until you understand what works. If it's somebody we've known for a long while, then we'll only send a couple. I think,
Okay.
and I look and I understand it's again ingrained in our system the way we've been brought up to look out for the competition,
Yeah.
as you say. So I think this actually harks back to the point I was making earlier, which is why it becomes important to build a relationship with your consultant, so that regardless of what the competition is, look, a good consultant will typically have the kind of relationship with the client, but the client will also ask him, what do you think? Who do you think will work for me? And that will have a certain weightage in the decision. It might be small, it will be low single digits, but it will be there and can potentially make the difference. So rather than wondering whether you're 1 of 10, 1 of 3, or 1 of 20, the right question to ask is, in my view, my humble view, is how do I make sure that the recruiter makes me one of his top 2 candidates when he's sending in whatever number of candidates he's sending. And that's going to basically depend on how much time you spend to the guy, you know, how much you've talked to him, how much you made sure he understands what you do, how you can contribute. See, a lot of recruiters have not had the benefit of, the way recruitment is in almost any country in the world, there are some recruiters who fall into recruitment after having had industry experience. A lot of them have actually only ever been recruiters from day one. They're people who spend 20, 25 years of their careers only doing recruitment. And for them, the reason they like talking very often to candidates is not just to understand the candidates, also because it gives them a window into the corporate world, a window which they're always into a world that they're always on the outside of, they're always on the periphery of, they're always looking in, right? And the very fact that he would take some time to talk to them, to explain to them what's happening in the company, etc., that can be really interesting for them. So these are some of the ways to, I think, get on side with the recruiters to make sure that however long his list is, you're on top of it.
That's an excellent tip. Thanks a lot. Moving on to the hiring process, we got a lot of questions on, how has the hiring process changed, and has it changed at all thanks to the pandemic, especially because now if recruiting is happening, you can't really go and meet either the consultant or the company right in the beginning. So a lot of things are happening online. So how to, better your presence online?
You're right. The entire process has gone online. In fact, we've had our first batches of candidates even been onboarded online, and they've worked for over a month without having physically met their hiring managers or gone into their offices. So because if everything has happened in the last 3 months, that's how it is. So look, the process going online has definitely again made things a little bit slower. There's obviously, in this world of work from home and everybody on a million calls, a lot of reschedules and all of that which happens, which can be frustrating for candidates. In terms of what candidates can do is a few things. At a very, very basic level, we'll start with that. One of the things that 2 or 3 of my clients have told me over the last couple of months is that a lot of candidates don't seem to care enough about how they present online compared to how they would in person. It's a very basic thing, and I'd like to believe, and I'm sure nobody in this group is guilty of that, but just putting it out there since you asked the question, saying the same guy who would maybe show up in a suit if he came for an interview thinks it's okay to be in a round neck t-shirt during an interview and may not have bothered to shave that day. These are all very basic things, but there seems to be a little bit of slippage when it comes to the online process is what I'm saying. So I think be a little mindful of that. Also, I feel a lot of people don't make enough effort to make sure that when they're being online, that they're actually presenting literally their best physical profile. The same person who would go to great pains before he went to an interview to spruce up and all of that, maybe just walking around the room, holding the phone in his hand and doing the interview like that, just because he struggles to sit in one place for 40 minutes during a Zoom call, which I understand, but you have to practice. Maybe do Zoom calls with your family members, maybe if it's possible to record them or whatever it is, but just be conscious of how you come across online. There are people whose cameras are sticking 9 inches below their faces, so the profile that you get is upwards with a little bit of nose hair sticking out, avoidable, right? I mean, it's all very basic stuff, but this is stuff that slips because people aren't used to it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that since, again, people are not meeting you personally, they're probably going to spend a little more time delving through your online profile. So I think even more important than during non-COVID times, I suggest have your LinkedIn's up to date. If there are any gaps there, fill them. Make sure that your LinkedIn profile and your CV profile match. Not suggesting you upload your entire CV, just make sure that the dates and the organizations are in line. If there are any other forums that you think that people can find you on, whatever those might be, make sure that they do not present anything that you would not want presented in public. I think all of that has become far more important than it was earlier. So those are the things to keep in mind. But apart from that, I mean, you do lose a little bit of the physical, the physical face-to-face interaction and the firm handshake and all of that. But you make up for that by trying to make sure there's good eye contact. And like I said, you've set yourself up well. And rest of it is really good old interviewing skills.
I'm really conscious of, what's behind
No,
me
you're looking
and
great,
where my
man.
camera
You're looking fine. Don't worry. You nailed the interview.
Thank you. Also, on these lines only, when you talk about online presence, is there any way to connect with the right hiring person? When you see a job online, especially these days, I believe that LinkedIn, people usually look for jobs on LinkedIn rather than going to individual companies. So LinkedIn jobs, and you find a job that you like and you want to reach out to that hiring manager if the name is provided. And even if the name is not provided, you would want to search for her or him. Is there a good way to do that?
It really boils down, it just boils down to old-fashioned networking. You have to be shameless. You have to be willing to pick up the phone to the person that is a common contact and ask for that introduction and try and get that. I think just be a little conscious that these days people's time is a lot less under the control than it was pre-COVID, because working from home is lending itself to 25-30% inefficiency. So an 8-hour working day has often become a 10-hour working day for people. So it's important not to be annoying also, because people are getting inundated with these requests. So one way of doing it is that if you can find a common contact, maybe ask that common contact to just put in a word, as opposed to necessarily trying to interact with an interviewer before a job interview, because that can be seen to be a little bit underhand or a little bit not so nice, right? So if you can find someone in the organization, or you have a common contact who's willing to put in a word just to say, hey, look, I know this guy, good guy, he's interviewing tomorrow. Can you just give him a good hearing? I think that's fine. But to try and actually meet an interviewer just because you're applying for a job, or especially after you've applied for the job, that's a slightly risky game to play, because it can come across as being just a little, you're trying to get a bit of an unfair advantage on the other candidates, right? I mean, it's just like under normal circumstances, if you were applying for a job through other means, say through a headhunter, the headhunter told you who the interviewer was, it may not be the best thing to try and reach out to the interviewer and ask for a coffee 2 days before the interview. It can probably put people off. So it's important to strike that balance.
In general terms, when you're not looking for a job or when you're not stressed out, all these things seem very, simple and straightforward and common sense. But unfortunately,
people don't do enough of that, Mandy. People don't do enough of that.
No, I agree, I agree. I think I might have done some of these things which I should not have, looking back.
Look, but, it's a learning process for everyone, and it's usually something that people go through. A lot of people really learn the value of it once they've been through a couple of slightly challenged periods. But having now spent 15-20 years in the workplace, I've just realized that the network is just so much more important than almost anything else. And I can't stress enough, just every opportunity you have to meet somebody, meet them, be nice to them, make sure they go away with a positive impression of you, because a guy that you dismiss today could be the difference between having a job and not having a job, 10 years later. And it's important. It's incredibly important.
Things which are told to you when you are in business school, and you're like, they don't sink in that time unless until you actually face those circumstances, and then you realize, and then you inculcate those habits.
Thing is,
You know,
in the business school, you tend to feel somewhat invincible, but then you
yes.
step out and look, for the last 10, 12 years, within 2, 3 years of everyone graduating, there's been some kind of major or
Mm,
mini crisis. So I think some of us have had to learn this faster than the hard way.
yeah, yeah. On that note only, a lot of questions were around how to tackle compensation discussions. I mean, these are usually sensitive discussions even under normal times.
Yeah.
And if in recent times, if you've been in a job and you've had to negotiate negotiate your salary a little downwards because of COVID, then how do you negotiate it up to pre-COVID levels? If you're having another job discussion or if you're recruiting or anything, so how do you go about this?
So we've actually seen this happen live to at least two candidates in the last month, one at a
That's good.
mid-level, one at a senior level position.
Hmm.
In both cases, they came from startups, um, and they had taken, I think, between 20 and 40% hits in their cash comp against some equity, which was given to them. And then they decided to start looking out. Not so much because of the cash comp cut, it was more that they weren't convinced about the prospects of the companies that they
Yeah.
were working for. So the way hiring companies are approaching this is that there is often a knee-jerk reaction saying that, oh, this is your current comp, this is what you're worth now, so why should I pay you more? What I'm actually finding is that companies that are serious about hiring are actually willing to match the pre-cut levels. It's obviously hard to negotiate an increase over that, to negotiate any increase right now in a serious role. Uh, but uh, but companies are also conscious that if they bring you on at your reduced compensation level, um, you will be starting off with a slightly bitter taste in your mouth. Um, and it's probably better to either not hire you or to give you what you had before you had your COVID cut, especially since the COVID cuts have all happened very recently in the last month or two. So I think at this point, taking a stand again to somebody who really wants you, where you are the preferred candidate, by just being gentle, being polite, but being firm, saying that, look, this is where the market is. There's just been a downward drift because of COVID, but there's no point in me joining you at this level because I know that that is the right level. And in fact, even in my other company, there's every chance that we'll get back there. I have found has done the trick. However, if you're stuck at the new post-COVID level for say 6 months or some time period, it's going to get harder then. Because right now you can still make the argument that this is a very, very temporary kind of situation, and almost every company that's made these salary cuts has made the point, even in the communications, that this is just temporary to help you tide over the period. But say you're in a company where 6 months later the level is still there, then I think you run the risk of getting re-rated to that level, and then no organization will really feel the pressure to or feel even any kind of moral pressure to get you back to your pre-COVID level. So my suggestion is that the first couple of months, 2-3 months, I think companies will largely cave. But beyond that, you start losing your negotiating power because it starts looking like your new normal.
And how about if you want to discuss perks like work from home?
Work from home is not a perk anymore. It's become a necessity. I think companies will be very happy to hear that. In fact, most companies are reducing the amount of seating space that they have. So I don't see stuff like flexibility in terms of where you work from. I don't see as being an issue. In fact, just the opposite. Companies want that, so I don't see that being a problem.
That's positive to learn. There's another question around comp levels only, and when you say that you negotiate saying that this is the current market level or this was the market level like month back, how do you find out those market levels? Like how do you get
whatever you were getting paid is where the market was. Whatever you were getting paid. See, because again, the conversation you're having with your recruiter, with your hiring manager or hiring HR is not a strategic conversation anymore. Now you've come down to tactics, right? Now you've really come down to a transaction between you and that person, right? And so what you have to implicitly try and tell that person without necessarily saying it in so many words is that I used to get paid X. Because of COVID, I've been taken down to 0.8X. I may as well just stay there and take my chances at coming back to X, as opposed to joining you for 0.8X, where you're forcing me to come flat because you think I'm in a difficult position, but I'm obviously taking a risk by moving as well. So even if you don't want to look at it as re-rating me back to my pre-COVID level, you can't expect me to come without charging you some risk premium for moving from where I am, right? But then you also have to be conscious that you do this before. So if you think your company is crumbling, you need to move quickly before the whole world starts thinking your company is crumbling. If your company is genuinely crumbling and the world knows it, then you're not in a strong negotiating position anymore, right? There's no magic bullet to this. The facts are all public. So before your company goes down the tube, if you're worried about going down the tube, I think you take action now. If your company is gone into liquidation or the founders have basically shut it down, how are you going to negotiate then? Because the market is going to assume that you're desperate.
Yeah. And I think your position also is not strengthened if you've been laid off. Like a lot of people have either left their jobs currently or have been asked to leave because of the current market scenario. So in such a case, negotiating your compensation with a future employer to a pre-COVID level is going to be even more challenging, I believe.
So that's a very different game then. That's a very different game, because then if you're laid off, then the best you can hope for is to be set within the existing range that the majority of their employees are, right? As opposed to trying to get what you used to get. The dynamic changes slightly because the reference point is no longer where you were. The reference point is where this company is at. And that is a relatively weaker negotiating position. The way to go about it in those cases is try and be in a position where you've been able to generate some options. Because frankly, if you have only one option, and you've been on the bench for a few months and the option is even halfway acceptable, you're going to put yourself under a lot of mental pressure to accept it for a variety of reasons. If you have the strength to hold out and wait it out both financially and mentally, then you're probably better off doing that. But I also understand that these are very uncertain times. For people who've lost jobs, it can be incredibly stressful. It can be mentally scarring for some people, and they just want to get back in. But in that case, maybe that's a constraint you want to release. Maybe and think of it like that.
Yeah, makes sense. At what point of recruitment should you start talking compensation? Because this is my personal experience, that the recruiter wants to learn what I've been getting or what I'm getting right now, but they don't want to share what is on offer, So, and you are the one who wants the job. So you can only hold out till a certain time by when you have to share what you've been getting without learning what they have to offer. So how do you try to get information out of a recruiter or executive search firm for that matter?
I think this is where the executive search firm has to step up. This is where the consultant has to step up. If he's a good, strong consultant, he should be able to give you a sense of what you're looking at through some combination of either extracting information from the company or finding out from his other sources to be able to give you a range. Sometimes there are firms, you'll have, especially in the startup world, you'll have certain companies who will deal with the entire recruitment process with a slightly more strategic view, and they look at it as kind of a shared exercise to try and get to a shared goal at the end, which hopefully means an offer. And if it doesn't happen, also to part as friends or whatever. There are other startups or other companies also that get into a very adversarial position from day one. They're trying to actually see what's the minimum they can get you in at. That's not necessarily a firm that you don't want to work at, but you also have to go in with your eyes open, saying this is what the culture is. It's always going to be a little bit of founding team versus the employees. And am I comfortable with that? And some people are, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that this tells you a little bit about the culture of the organization on day one. But I don't think you should feel pressure to, you should feel that you're running absolutely blind until you think you're kind of reaching the point of no return, where you've kind of gotten so invested with the company that when they come out with an offer that makes no sense, you feel completely let down. I think you can recognize when you're getting close to that point, and you have every right to ask the intermediary, the executive search firm in that space, to say, look, I'm really not comfortable engaging with the same intensity until I at least have some idea of what they're thinking for me. We can't get to a point where I go to the end and then I get smacked in the face with something that's completely useless. I think you can do that. And if you are speaking directly to the firm, then you can have the conversation with them. If they're not telling you, they don't want to tell you. So you got to make them tell you.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not an easy situation to be in. I recognize that. It's not. But if you're choosing to play with, this group of you're choosing to work with a company like this rather than an established American MNC, then you will also have to play by slightly different rules.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so diverting a little bit, we also had some questions around international positions, like if people want to look for jobs in, let's say, other countries within Asia. Your focus is Asian countries. So how's the hiring scenario over there? Is it similarly bad as in India, or how do you negotiate and go about it?
Yeah, so see, the world has become a little more isolated over the last few years. A lot of countries have been putting up certain barriers to hiring people from abroad, largely in a response to political pressure. Right? In Singapore, for example, the scenario is very different from the scenario 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was almost unheard of for employment passes to be rejected as long as you were above a certain income level. It's become far more common and widespread now over here. Dubai also is moving towards a slightly more kind of Dubai-centric approach. Although their indigenous population being small, it's harder for them. Kuwait yesterday announced that they want to reduce their reliance on expats. Saudi is not necessarily a destination of choice for many people, but Saudi has a very clear written policy now about Saudi Arabians first. So I think in general, for people from our part of the world, where a lot of people do want to have some foreign experience, I think you have to be a little smart about, whichever destination you want to be in. I think you have to start by trying to see what are the skills that are specifically in demand there. What kind of people do they lack? Do they not have enough of? The answer in the Gulf at one time used to be almost everyone because of their small populations, but I think now that's really only true for certain segments like technology and the related ecosystem in the Gulf. If you look at, say, Singapore, for example, Singapore has a very deep and high quality labor market of its own. It's just that it's not always big enough for what it wants to do. Again, technology, data science, analytics, those kinds of roles are roles for which there is demand and for which people are looking from outside. Insurance is one industry where insurance and fintech are industries where India is perceived as a leader in terms of knowledge and talent. And I think that's recognized almost worldwide. So if you're looking for a move into other parts of Asia, if you've got an angle in some of these areas, that's probably something to lead with. However, I would say that if one of your short to medium term objectives, for whatever reason, is to do a stint outside India, if you're working for an organization with offices outside of India, your best bet, at least to get out, is going to be to try and do it with the organization. So if you are working for an MNC, for example, which has offices across the region or across the world, try and see if over time you can engineer something with them. Because there are risks otherwise also, right? Because you're in an organization, you have equity within the organization, personal equity, personal brand equity. If things go south, then you're not going to be stuck in a different country with 1 month to leave the country and all of that. They're more likely to take care of you. Otherwise, in volatile times like these, if you leave the country, there's a lot of last in first out that happens, right? There have been cases of senior people in senior positions in very well-known companies in India who've accepted jobs in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. And then because of COVID, they haven't been able to get onto their flights, and those offers have been rescinded. And all of a sudden, you've given up the job you have, and you don't have anything here either. Now, this is, of course, again, a very extreme scenario playing out right now. But in general, I think it'll be easier to move with your own organization. If not, anything tech-related, data-related, digital-related, those are the areas I think to lead with right now. Those general management kind of roles, head of sales, head of marketing, those kinds of roles are going to get harder and harder to get overseas positions in.
And on that point, honing in on that point, when you say insurtech or fintech, the roles that I generally see or I can understand being transportable to other markets would mainly be around the tech side, right? You're a product manager well, or you're an engineer, yeah. But not on the business development side, because that requires local specific expertise.
True. So you do have to contend with that. So that's exactly the point I was making. The more general management, relationship-oriented roles, those are going to get hard now because people are going to be able to find that in their own markets. You have to bring some, because the constraints have become higher, you have to bring something a little more unique. And technical skills are something that are in short supply in this part of the world. So I think you have a better chance with that than with the more generic roles. What we're also seeing is a little bit of activity in the buy side with respect to operating type roles. Some companies have been hiring for those kinds of roles. And for that also, they occasionally look at talent from India because people who've been in the ecosystem in India usually have dealt with the same problem, but on a much larger scale. That is another area that definitely, in fact, one of the largest PE funds over here, VCs actually, not PE funds, have just moved an operating partner from a similar organization in India. He starts next week. So there is a bit of that as well.
That's interesting to know. We have a question actually from one of the audiences, and I think it's relevant to the current train of thought that we have. And the person wants to know that moving internationally in terms of moving from US back to India in current times, and this, a lot of us face it. I faced it a few years back too. How do you suggest assessing the situation, and how do you go about finding the roles? Is it going to be any different for Indian companies looking for somebody coming from the US, especially in times like my personal experience was, everybody said that, why don't you come here first and then we'll talk about it. But when you're here and you're not working anymore, which kind of, weakens your position at the first place because you're jobless. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, it's a tough one. You've got to take a call either way. You're going to lose the entire ability to network and immerse yourself in the local network if you're going to try and do it remotely. Plus, especially if you're on the West Coast, time zone difference of 12 hours will make it well near impossible. So again, either you're doing something that's in immense demand, in which case it shouldn't matter. Otherwise, trying to engineer something from there without actually being here is going to be hard. One way of doing it, and there are people who've done it with some success, is try and see if you're able to get away from your work for maybe a week, a month, over a 3-month period, and invest that time in immersing yourself within the ecosystem, the relevant ecosystem in India. But trying to do that from abroad, especially in a very relationship-oriented market like India, is hard unless you really know people well, or there's somebody who can really bat for you. I think you need to be there.
There is no substitute for physical presence.
It's tough. I mean, obviously, right now I guess COVID gets you a get out of jail card for that, saying that, look, I would have loved to be there, but I can't. So maybe you can drag it out for a few months like that. But under normal circumstances, it's hard. to do that remotely.
Yeah. And how about an industry change in the current times? And we've spoken about geography change. If somebody
Look,
wants
it's
to
the
change
same at the end
industries
of the
at
day.
this, yeah,
It's the same underlying principle, right? You have to make yourself relevant.
yeah,
Nobody owes you anything, regardless of whether you have an MBA from the University of Chicago or not, regardless of
hmm,
how great a job you did in your last organization. Somebody needs to find you relevant, and that's what you need to figure out. So, is it a skill? Is it a relationship? Is it an innate ability? What is it? You need to lead
hmm,
with that, and you need to talk to hundreds of people to understand what it is that they're looking for. Too many
hmm,
people get too caught up with, I've done all this great stuff over there, therefore I can also do great stuff for you. That's often not enough. Uh, People need to know that you will hit the ground running from day one, otherwise they'll just take somebody from their own industry, right?
yeah,
So you have to find what it is that's really relevant for them in what you've done and lead with that.
yeah,
And this is all very theoretical, but there is no there is no magic bullet for this, especially in a challenge time like this. In fact, at a challenge time like this, you're probably best advised to stay put where you are.
yeah, makes sense. That's a nice segue into the questions that we have that most of the candidates struggle with, whether you are doing your MBA or whether you're out of job in the current times, is how to position your resume and to make it very, very general or to make it specific. And from what I learned from our conversation as of now, especially for these times, is you have to make yourself relevant to companies, to whosoever is hiring.
Yeah.
So make sure your resume reflects that when you're applying to a particular position, is what I understand from what you're saying.
Yeah, I think in a market like this, especially, you're right. I think most in this market, but it's fairly common for people to have more than one version of their resumes.
Yeah.
For example, if somebody's got a background in private equity, for example, but they're also applying to VC, then obviously they'll put a different kind of transaction, a different kind of history on that. Not because you're lying, it's just about putting the relevant information and leading with the relevant information, which is fundamentally the same. I think having different resumes, horses for courses, is fine. I think it's actually good. Just a few tips there. Please don't have gaps in your resume. Nothing annoys recruiters more than having gaps in your resume which are not explained. It's fine to say that you took a break from work, but it's not fine to have the recruiter, hiring manager asking you, oh, there's a break in your resume for 3 months. What were you doing then? Because there's always that 1% feeling in your head, why did this person not put it there? Are they trying to hide something? So just one very important tip for everyone.
So even a 3-month break should be explainable. Like,
it should be mentioned. It doesn't have to be explained. You don't owe anyone any explanations. But a resume is typically March 2016 to March 2020. And then June 2021 to whatever, and you can just say break, or even if you don't put anything there, be transparent about the dates. If it's a short break, that's fine, you were within jobs. But if it's 1 year or something, then have an explanation. It could be maternity, it could be dealing with a personal situation, whatever it is, but put something there.
Fair enough. And always a struggle. 1-page resume, 2-page resume.
1 page. Unless you're Barack Obama is the only person in my book who's allowed 2 pages. Nobody else is. So no, I'm joking over here. Look, 1 page.
You cleared your political leanings quite straightforward.
Whatever people are comfortable with is fine. It's just that in my 3 years of this business that I'm running, I've never found a 2-page resume till date that needed to be 2 pages. Till date. And I'm talking about, first year graduates through to CXO level. I am yet to find a resume that needed to be more than 1 page long. The amount of time and energy we've spent on working with with some of our senior candidates on cleaning up the resumes has been more work than the actual hiring process. So some simple things, for God's sake, you do not need to put a statement of intent or a mission statement or a purpose statement or anything like that on top of your resume. Nobody cares about that. Companies pay the McKinseys and BCGs of the world millions of dollars for that. They really don't need you to be saying on top of your CV that my mission is to use my skills and my knowledge to make my organization better and contribute meaningfully to society. It adds nothing to anybody's life. Another way that people lose space on their resumes is, and I think this is because maybe there are templates which are available on the net, but people have these graphics on their resume where they have a timeline of what they did, or they'll have a margin on the left which will provide some kind of highlight information, or my favorite, where people put a photograph on their resume. None of that is required. It's just facts. It's just relevant facts telling the basic skeleton of a story that you're then going to flesh out when you meet your recruiter. It's nothing more than that. The only mission statement that I accept is I want to join a company that gives free food. Anything else is not acceptable.
All right. Thanks a lot, Saurabh. I don't think we have any more questions, and we've